Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome to this month's forum. My name is Tim Sink. I'm president of the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce, and I'm grateful to see you all here and for joining us for this important discussion this morning. And please continue to enjoy your breakfast as we get this program underway. Just wanted to recognize a few folks that are joining us today. It's always great to see Mayor Jim Boulay here with us. Welcome, Mayor. Thank you for being with us. Also, a number of board members are with us today. City Manager Thomas Spell is a member of the Chamber Board. Jim Remus, representing Riverbend. Our board chair, Tanya Rochette, is with us, our brand new board chair this month. So, Tanya, thanks for being here. And our immediate past chair, Leslie Walker, is here from Mason & Rich. So, morning, Leslie, and thank you all for being here. I hope I didn't miss any. Aaron Shake is immediate past SIPN chair and member of the board of directors, so it's great to see Aaron here as well. So, just a couple of things. We're hitting on some key issues this morning impacting workforce in New Hampshire. And this really has to do, pre-COVID, talent was the biggest challenge that New Hampshire businesses were dealing with. And post-COVID, that has just been exacerbated this much more. Just a kind of an example of where we are. Pitco Friolater recently announced in yesterday's paper that they were moving to a spot in Concord, and they're offering a $2,000 sign-on bonus. So those types of signs out there are showing you how deep this issue really goes. We have three panelists that are going to talk about some of the impacts on labor when it comes to childcare, it comes to housing, and these three folks really know their stuff. So we're in good shape to get started. I'm going to introduce each speaker separately. They'll come up and make a few remarks, take a seat at the table, and then we'll do some Q&A at the very end. So our first speaker is Brian Gottlub. And Brian in 2019 became the director of the New Hampshire Economic and Labor Market Information Bureau. So prior to that, Brian was the principal and founder of Polycon, a research company in Dover, New Hampshire. And for more than 25 years, Brian completed research projects for the energy financial services, telecommunications, real estate, legal lobbying industries, think tanks, and chambers of commerce, higher education institutions, government, and economic development organizations in New Hampshire and in 30 other states. Brian, prior to founding Polycon in 2001, Brian was Vice President for Fiscal and Economic Policy at the Business and Industry Association of New Hampshire. So please welcome Brian Gottlub.
Thank you very much, Tim. That bio was very nice. It's almost as if I wrote it myself. I'm going to go through a number of slides, and I'm going to go through them quickly because we will have time after the presentations to take some questions. So I'm going to cover a lot of ground. I'm also going to tell you that I'm going to highlight a lot of the problems, but not the solutions. And that's one of the great jobs, one of the great abilities of my job is I get to talk about the problems without having to address any of the solutions. So the key thing about this child care issue is that it preceded the pandemic, but the pandemic greatly exacerbated the situation. For a couple of decades, at least one decade, I've said the greatest challenge that New Hampshire faces is going to be on labor supply issues. The pandemic, I believe, has highlighted that. And it's highlighted it not just, I think, in New Hampshire, but in throughout the country. But New Hampshire specifically, and the Northeast in general, are going to suffer from labor shortages for some time. So childcare is critical to supporting our economic recovery. One of the challenges we're facing right now is that we don't have people who are going back into the labor force at the rates that we need them to fully recover. And a big part of that is female labor force because they're generally more affected by child care issues. And child care is critical to the long-term growth of our economy because, again, the key, as I see it, to New Hampshire's economy is going to be maximizing the number of people who are in the labor force, their skill level, and our ability to match the skills that are in demand with the skills that are in supply. That's the great challenge that we face. Excuse me. So prior to the pandemic, and a lot of the data that I'm putting together here precede the pandemic, one of the challenges during the pandemic is that data hasn't been as timely as we need it to be. And government data in particular, and if I may disparage my own house, has been a little bit slower in coming out during the pandemic. But prior to the pandemic, there was about 56,000, or 27% of the children in New Hampshire were in households where parents had some need for childcare, and that's about 10,000 more than the supply of licensed providers in the state. Now, there are non-licensed providers in the state, and a lot of people, it doesn't mean that 10,000 individuals who were in need, or those children in need of childcare, weren't getting some services, but they were relying on either non-licensed childcare or things like family, friends. All of those things were disrupted during the pandemic. You know, if you had your child watched by grandma, well, maybe the pandemic prevented that from occurring. So the pandemic has really exacerbated the problem, and there's a breakdown showing who among different family types have the greatest need to have a child in daycare. So it runs the gamut. Think of it, both married couple families, single parents, it runs the gamut. The critical factor in the pandemic is that it decimated the industry, had really substantial impacts. But it also it decimated the supply of providers, but it also created increased demand. How did it do that? Well, schools were closed primarily, and that meant a lot of kids were at home who normally would have been in some form of childcare. So what you see here is what happened, and these are just employers that have employees. So it doesn't include maybe the single person daycare that doesn't have any employees, a woman who runs, or a man who runs a daycare out of their home. This is just employers that have employees, so they're in our employment system. So you see the decline in the number of establishments prior to the pandemic, Q2 2019, now lost about 60 providers. And these are, again, tend to be the larger providers because they have employees. Employment, big drop in employees. I follow unemployment claims and the number of people collecting unemployment. This industry was one of the largest in terms of numbers of people who were collecting unemployment insurance, and they could collect for a number of reasons: pandemic-related health issues, child care issues, a lot of issues. So it's rebounded, but it's still almost 1,000 individuals down from prior. So the supply issues will remain, and we know all labor force is a challenge at the moment. This industry is one of the most challenged. Just taking a look at most recent survey, Census Bureau now has established a number of surveys in order to assess the impacts of the pandemic. One of them is Household Pulse Survey. This just tracks responses to one question, which is asking people reasons why they were not participating in the workforce. And one of the biggest reasons is childcare, citing the need to care for a child. And this just tracks the very beginning of the pandemic, or near the beginning of the pandemic, April of 2020, and I should have put the years there, down to the most recent survey, which ended in September. And you see, if you average that out, it's somewhere around 20,000 individuals, and it's largely women, because they are the primary caregivers in families, generally primary caregivers in families. So averaging it out, it's somewhere around 20,000 individuals kept out of the labor force. Now, it doesn't mean every one of those individuals is going to go back if they didn't have child care issues, but that's the potential. I mean, that's the potential number of people who are not working because they have to care for a child. Some of them, if given child care opportunities, may still decide not to participate in the labor force, but it's still a big number. Taking a look at who cites the need for child care and their inability to obtain it, we see that the individuals that have lower levels of educational attainment are more likely to be affected by the child care issue. And that makes sense. I mean, you know, if you're in a two-age or married couple family, both professionals, it's expensive to get child care, but you know, you may be able to find it somewhere. You have greater resources to do it. So who's affected the most? high school graduates and below. Over half, that represents over half the people who say they're not in the labor force because of childcare issues. And think about which industries are experiencing the greatest labor force challenges right now. A lot of them are in lower wage occupations that hire individuals with lower levels of educational attainment. Food services is one. Some of the healthcare industries that employ less skilled individuals. So it tends to be industries that hire a high percentage of female employees. So it's really exacerbating some of the problems that we see, particularly in food services and some of the healthcare services industries. The childcare issue is exacerbating some of our most severe labor shortages in industries. This is just a chart that shows what's happened to female labor force participation, going back to 2000. It should be 2020, the left one. I mislabeled that, but you see it's down by about 4% or so. Yeah, about 3%. Now, male labor force has also declined for different reasons, but childcare tends to be a big one. The other big issue affecting this is that women tend to be employed in industries that have more face-to-face contact. So during the pandemic, those were jobs that tended to be, have more health-related concerns, so people stepped out of the labor force. So it's a combination of factors. The child care issue, the health concerns have contributed. And this is absolutely key, because a big part of the reason why New Hampshire's labor force has grown over the past few decades is that we've increased labor force participation among women. We have among the highest labor force participation rates among women. Why? Because we have well-educated women, for the most part, and they participate. Well-educated women is a good indicator of labor force participation. So we need to get more women back into the labor force and encourage that. It's just not an issue of individuals who can't work because of childcare. It's how childcare issues are affecting even people who are in the workforce. And this is just, again, survey-based research from the Census Bureau from New Hampshire, indicating some of the ways individuals have been affected who are in the workforce because of childcare issues. So you see, and all of these have been exacerbated. This survey is basically started during the pandemic, so we don't have pre-pandemic measures, but I would argue that prior to the pandemic, people have been affected by child care issues. Somebody has a sick child, they don't have an opportunity to on a short-term basis, obtain child care, so they take a day off work, or they cut their hours back. So, whole host, and I can't even read these but big impact during the pandemic, people worked remotely, so schools were out, they had to take care of a child. Now, that affects your productivity. If you have to work from home and you have to watch a child, one or more children. How many of you, I can't remember a Zoom meeting during the pandemic where somebody didn't have a child that was running around in background. Now, that has to have an impact on productivity. So unpaid leave, somebody didn't look for a job, adult in the household cut work hours. All of these things affect the productivity, not just of individuals, but of our economy, of individuals and the economy as a whole. So huge productivity impacts, even if it's not necessarily keeping people out of the labor force, absolutely. So I did and there's a lot that goes into this background information, so I did a simulation where I said, what would happen if we could get the number of people who are not in the labor force because they have to have they have a need for child care? What would the potential gains in labor force be at different rates? Could we get 10% of those people back in, 20? So I thought a reasonable number would be somewhere between 30 and 40% of individuals. And that number, 10,000, by the way, is the number, that shortage that I showed you in terms of licensed daycare, people who needed it, and the shortage of providers. But if we get 10,000 people, that's about 35% of the potential out there. I think that's a very reasonable estimate. That's a pretty good increase in the number of individuals working in the state. And what would that mean? It would mean And I run an econometric model, about 12,000 more employees over the decade. Those people would be working, 10,000 people, they're earning, they're spending, so that creates a multiplier effect. So over 12,000 more jobs in the state, more employment in the state, if we could just get that 35%. I think that's a reasonable goal. Last slide. So which industries would be affected the most? Again, using an econometric model of simulations. It would be service industries, and that's a big aggregation, but when you think about what I'm including in service industries, food services is one of them. Healthcare is another big one. Educational services. By the way, that's my timer, 11 minutes and 15 seconds. So retail, wholesale, industries that tend to employ women would be the most affected, most benefited. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to whomever.
I guess it's George.
Thank you, Brian. So now we will switch from childcare to housing. And we have with us George Reagan, is the Community Engagement Manager at New Hampshire Housing, a position he has held since 2008. In this role, George has developed working relationships with a variety of community members and regional workforce housing advocacy organizations, providing education, technical assistance and support, as well as educating employers, civic and community leaders, public officials, business partners, and the general public about the connections between an adequate and balanced supply of housing and economic growth and stability. And I was also reminded this morning that probably 35 years ago, George and I played in the same garage band. So it's a small state. So please welcome George Reagan.
Since I'm a musician, I'll try to make this creative if at all possible, but being a housing authority, we're going to show you even a ton more charts and graphs. But they'll be fun to look at, and they're a different color scheme than Brian's. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the housing dynamics in the rental market, the purchase market, and then also talk a little bit about some of the factors that influence the price and availability of housing in New Hampshire. And like Brian, may not offer a ton of solutions, but try to provide some resources to help communities that are trying to find solutions to their housing challenges. So I'll start off with the rental market. New Hampshire Housing every year does an annual rent survey. We do that all throughout the state, and we collect a lot of data to just chart the trends of rent across the state. This is the statewide number, and the teal colored line is are what looks like two-bedroom gross rent. So gross is rent plus utilities. So if you notice, all through the recession and post-recession, the monthly rent cost continued to climb for two-bedroom as well as all-bedroom, which is the other number, $1,373 a month. And so those are quite high when we talk about other cost factors. Brian was talking about childcare, but having access to it, but also paying for it is one of the chief drivers, and just the ability to pay your rent, afford to move up into home ownership. So we've seen the 5-year change in both those, about 24% for the two-bedroom and 23%. So we're seeing that continue to go up, and along with that, the vacancy rate. I think we've probably heard about this. If anyone is trying to find an apartment to rent, they're hard to come by. I'm personally gratified when someone finds not only something to rent, but an apartment to rent that actually is nice, safe, affordable, and meets the needs of the people that are living in it. And I say that, and that's really important, because when we connect that back to economic development, I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding that, and maybe it's our own, our tough upbringing, but that people will just live anywhere. And we're competing for labor force all over the country and the world. And I think it's important to note that people are looking for a place to live that's going to be suitable to their needs, housing being a chief factor of it, among other things. Thankfully, New Hampshire has a lot of great other attributes that bring people in, but I think we need to remind ourselves that most of that labor force we're trying to get in now for the jobs that are increasing in Hitco and other places, we're trying to get from outside, because our unemployment rate is really low. So we are in competition for that same person all across the country. So a balanced market, I think I've got another slide that shows this, would be about a 5% vacancy rate 2% is kind of turnover. As you can see, we're kind of under 1%. And we'll see how that shakes out across the state in terms of increase in rent, gross rent, and also looking at county by county vacancy. So this is the state of New Hampshire. And if you look, if you can see those numbers, what I can tell you is that and it's the percent change in 2-bedroom for the last 5 years. So the top number is a gross rent, and then the bottom is what the percentage increase is. So everywhere, including Coos County, and that number may be a lot lower, but incomes are a lot lower. That's sort of a human-powered economy up there, so different employment, different income. We just completed a study partly funded by the Neil and Louise Tillotson Fund that really took a look at that and the labor force there and the economy. And so even though that number is quite a lot lower, it's still a high number, and as you can see, it gets higher as we get to the southern part of New Hampshire. Grafton County is driven a lot by Hanover and Lebanon. That's a major economic center there. So when we look at rents, maybe way outside that area, maybe somewhat less, but also probably the availability of it is a lot less. So here's getting back to what the balanced market will look like, what turnover would be, and essentially where we are in every county across New Hampshire. We've got a vacancy problem. We don't have enough places for people to live that want to live here. And I think the rental part, important to start, is important because if we think about our own trajectory, we probably, especially if we came here from away, we might have started by finding a place to rent, starting a job, or moving to another place in New Hampshire, starting a job, or continuing, trying to find roots. I clearly hear that even from top level folks coming into hospital CEO and looking for a place to purchase, can't find it, looking for a place to rent. So that challenge is all across your income levels. But as we can see, it's a challenge all across the state in terms of vacancy rates. I'll try to get to some of those drivers. So I'm going to drill down a little bit. This is Concord. So the goldenrod is a 2-bedroom unit, so the gross rent is about $1,450, and that tracks closely what the state median gross rent is, and then for all units is $1,275. So that's what's happening in Concord. And if we look at the vacancy rate in Concord, some volatility there in terms of the vacancy, but for the last couple of years it's been below 3%, 2%. So it's a challenge here as it is everywhere, and a supply problem. This slide just sort of gets at affordability, and that's really important to us. Again, not only is there a unit that's able to be rented, but is it affordable? So when we look at the incomes in these counties and then what's available, or how many available at that purchase price, and that's or rental price, and that's paying no more than 30% of your gross income on rent. So if you were to sort of divide the 1448 divided by 30%, you'd come up to and if I had thought about that, I would have done that last night, but I didn't do the math. But that's what's available to someone in income that's affordable. And that's, again, these numbers say two things. One, about how many are available to them that's affordable, but also the other piece is, are they vacant or are they otherwise occupied? So moving into the purchase market, here's what we see. So that's the multiple listing service, median sales price. So this is new construction, all construction. And we keep seeing that as well post-recession. The number keeps going up. We've heard a ton of stories, right, about the competition for housing, people paying over market. That's affected the real appraisal part, where appraisal values go up as well. And so there's a real competition for people that are downsizing and have some equity with people that, again, are dealing with maybe a first job or moving up and dealing with ongoing college debt, childcare issues, and the like, including transportation, especially if they've got to commute somewhere that they can afford to live to get into their job. So from June 20 to 2021, we can see it went up about 60,000, about a 19% increase. And then the inventory, are any realtors in the audience? Yeah, yes. And so they're dealing with sales that are at all-time high, but a really shrinking inventory to help with their own customers looking for places to live. So it's a real challenge. So here we have, again, 6 months would be considered a balanced market, a seller's market. Less than 6 months is a seller's market. 6 months or above, or right around there, is balanced. So Merrimack County is about 2.9 months, and statewide we're right around the same. maybe 2.7 just in the 3 months. So that's the sales pace. That's the number of units we have for sale at the sales pace, and how many months it would take if we didn't put any more houses on the market for them to churn. So that's not a lot of lag time. And so what's it look like in Merrimack County? The goldenrod are existing homes at about 280,000 is the median, so it's a midpoint sale price, which is certainly a lot better than the statewide median of about 380. And then the new homes are higher, and they generally are higher. New homes are, and some of that may go back to we'll go back to a lot of things that I'll touch on in a minute. But what we've seen is there's not a whole lot of new home sales, new homes that are created that go on the market either. So, and I'll show that in a slide in a minute. Here's what it looks like in Concord, about 260,000 or so. The goldenrod is the median sales price for an existing home. We lost the whatever color that line is. It's fuchsia. I need to talk to the people in Hampshire Housing about their color schemes. That's because we've just got numbers less than 50, so we kind of consider it volatile. It doesn't mean there hasn't been new units, but those have been up around 260 or so, almost in line with existing. So that's what's happening around here. And of course, driving a lot of this is mortgage rates. They're at an all-time low, so people are trying to buy those homes. People are refinancing their homes, and what's important about that, I'm one who did a lot of renovations. A lot of people are doing that because while I may be able to sell my house for a decent amount of money, I also need to pay that to buy a house somewhere else. So a lot of people are looking at refinancing, which is great. It's a great time to do it, but that's a house that's not on the market. And so this is sort of the slide that tells the story about production. And when you see the blue line, those are single-family homes, and the yellow line is multi-unit, multi-family. So multifamily, even though it's a little erratic, has kind of stayed stable. It was kind of the chief supplier of rental units throughout the recession. We have the low-income housing tax credit program. So Catch here would be one of those organizations that put some developments in and continue to do that and add to the supply of affordable rental units. But as you can see, post-recession, it really dipped down a lot, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But that's sort of what indicates here what our chief problem is, and it's just trying to get supply, getting houses back on the market, and more rental units built. And so these are some of what I would call the impediments. To me, it's the 5 L's: lumber, labor, land, loans, and laws. And I think we've heard that the cost of building materials has been really astronomical. There's a nonprofit developer in the Lakes region trying to do some 20 single-family units, and just the bid for the materials is so much so that they've got to wait to do that. The labor force, we've talked about that. If they're home taking care of kids, they're not out here maybe building houses. And we've lost some of that skilled labor force, and we've lost that in terms of the trades being taught in schools or people being interested in those trades. But if anyone's tried to get a plumber or electrician, it's not easy to do. So that is a real important factor. Land, certainly, and I think there's a finite amount of land, and a lot of folks that I talk to might say, we're all built out, but sometimes that's because we've got maybe larger lot zoning and we're not so much built out, we've just used a lot of land for a single purpose. So intensity of land use can be an opportunity. If anyone listened to Joe Minicozy from Urban 3, who talks about value per acre, we kind of touch on that depending on where you choose to intensify your land use, you might be able to get more value per acre, more revenue for your community versus the expenses for that particular lot or the upkeep or municipal services. Loans and financing is a really huge deal, but not so much now. I think the cost of credit is low on the commercial side, certainly is on the consumer side, which leaves us to laws, regulatory practices, and I think that's a real important piece. In my work, talking with communities, especially ones that are saying we're concerned about a lack of housing for our kids that can't come back or for young families, I often say, let's take a look at our land use regulations. And I think, Matt, we were talking about, there was a report the other day from the Jason Sorens and Josiah Bartlett Center talking about this. I will say, if you've read it, they mistakenly said building codes when they really mean land use regulations. It was kind of a mess up in words, but those really factor in. There are places that might have zoning that's really restrictive, and the question is, what purpose does that serve? And so I sort of go down that road, and do I, in this slide, so do I sort of go down that road by, when talking to a community, kind of talk about what's going on in the state and in a region. We've got an aging population, but we do have younger adults that are looking for similar housing. So I live in a ranch, so I'm an older person, but younger people may want that as well. And that's a type of housing that isn't so much allowed these days through land use regulations, as well as the cost of maybe materials to do that. So we have to think of density and number of units that can be built. Definitely older adults that want to age in their house or in a community. And that's a big one, because I do hear stories, and maybe you do too, of people that they don't need their 4-bedroom house anymore. They're trying to downsize, but they don't have a place in that community to downsize to. And what are employers looking for? That's a real important thing. I think it's important to put a human face on housing and affordable housing, rather than maybe data and numbers and area median income. And when we do that, we might think differently about what our land use regulations allow or disallow. And those are some of the questions. What are your housing options now? Who are you trying to attract and retain? And really, the one solution doesn't apply. And I think that it's important to sort of tackle head on our own myths and mythology about affordable housing or variety of housing. And it's important in just community and economic development in your community and in the region. And so I'll back up to this. This is sort of that market summary. There's a stronger demand for housing. That's upward pressure. Renter incomes, they've increased a lot more in the last few years than in the previous 10. But rent has gone up significantly, as we've talked about before. And so that impact is, do we feel it when an employer decides to grow somewhere else or actually start a business somewhere else? And New Hampshire, we all thrive on a growing economy, and so there's that linkage back. And so I'll end with, we try to help with understanding and educating and providing tools. These are some of the things that we put out to help communities. And then there's also this Municipal Technical Assistance Grant Program that's available to communities should they want to explore housing barriers and solutions a lot more. So I've gone over by 2 minutes and 49 seconds, so I'll end there.
I think we may have some good news coming up in our next segment, I hope. Our next speaker, Matt Walsh, is a fellow New Hampshire native. Matt holds a BS in Community Development and a master's degree in Public Administration from UNH. And for the past 20 years, Matt's been employed by the City of Concord in a variety of posts. Since 2013, he served as the city's Director of Redevelopment, Downtown Services, and Special Projects. And in this capacity, he's responsible for managing several of the city's economic development programs, tools, and initiatives. He also negotiates and manages real estate transactions, as well as public-private partnerships to advance the city's economic development goals and objectives. Matt is also responsible for preparation of the city's capital improvement program, as well as management of all aspects of special capital projects, such as the recently completed Citywide Community Center at Keach Park, the Merrimack Lodge at White Park, and School Street Parking Garage renovation. So please welcome Matt Walsh.
Thank you, Tim. It's rare that somebody introduces me and says I have good news, so. Good morning, everybody. I have a timer of 11 minutes and 45 seconds. We'll see how this goes. So actually my presentation, here we go, perfect. Great, so we've talked about New Hampshire, more of a macro level. I'm going to talk about the micro level at the local level. Local government's where the rubber meets the road. So you've heard about all these problems, especially we feel it more acutely at the local level, and people look to us to try and solve them. So we're going to give you a bit of a discussion about that today. There's some stats up that are up on the screen here. You can see our housing supply. In about 10 years, we've added 574 units. That's about 50 units a year. Not a lot. Vacancy rates, George already talked about that, but in Concord right now, all units is 0.3%. Two-bedroom units, 0.6%, and a balanced market is 5%. So we already know that. You can see the median single-family home prices there over the last decade. They've gone up by about $80,000 or 42%, and obviously that has been more acute in the last year or two or three. Some quick facts about some of the affordable housing in Concord. So tax credit units. You You might hear of low-income housing tax credits, types of housing that Catch Neighborhood Housing develops. There's about 400 of those in Concord. The majority have been built since 2000, so the last 20 years. Section 8 vouchers usually come up in conversation. There's about 373 of those. They've gone up from about 200 in 2008, so that's a current number. Shelter always comes up for homeless people. It's a big conversation here in Concord. You can see what the stats there are. There's roughly a little under 100 beds here in Concord. Some of those are seasonal, and we're excluding some other providers that are currently in our community. Childcare is a big issue as well. There are 29 facilities in Concord that are licensed that have capacity for just under 2,700 children. There are about 6,400 children in Concord that are under the age of 14. 14 might be a little bit old for childcare, but I think of after-school programs. During the COVID shutdown, I know the 14-year-old that lives next door to me could have really benefited from that based on what I saw him do all day while I was home. The average cost of childcare statewide right now is $1,000, a little more than that if you have an infant. If you're pre-K, it's about $865 a month. That's real money for folks that are out there having to make a living. Wages in the childcare industry are atrocious. The median is about $23,000. The average in New Hampshire is $25,000. You cannot live on that. So we're asking people that are integral to our economy and to our social lives to take care of our children so we can work and be productive to make next to nothing. And especially here in Concord, where our median household income is about $67,000. So if you're paying $1,000 a month for childcare on top of your rent, on top of your utilities, it becomes very challenging to live. So what are the tools? These are some of the challenges we have, and there are tools at the local level. Some of these are provided by the federal government and the state government, but just to go through them quickly, there's the sale or lease of municipal real estate. You know, the city can get involved directly by supporting these causes by doing real estate deals. There are property tax incentives, particularly in the housing side of things. If the city owns a piece of property, we might make some improvements to it before we sell it on to a developer so they can build a housing or childcare facility. Infrastructure improvements, off-site improvements, water, sewer, roadway improvements, things like that. Grants, the two big ones that we go to here typically are community development block grants, which are a federal program from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The money comes from the feds, goes to the state through the New Hampshire Community Development Finance Authority, and then is available to communities. Concord is a non-entitlement community, so we have to compete for that when we have projects that we want to support, unlike Nashua, Manchester, Portsmouth, Rochester, Somersworth. And it only goes out in $500,000 slugs, and there's only about $10 million a year to compete for. So there's not a lot there when it comes to New Hampshire, and that number hasn't changed from the feds in forever. There is a revolving loan fund program. The city actually has a loan fund program like a bank that was established in 1983 that we've used to further some of these initiatives. Regulatory strategies, which are self-explanatory, and we'll talk about how we apply all of these to examples here in town. So the first one is, how do we apply the tools to childcare? We've been doing this for a long time. So the first one really is Second Start. This is in the old Garrison School that was sold by the Concord School District in the 1980s to Second Start for a nominal amount of money. There is a child care center there with a capacity for 200 children. So in addition to child care, they also do alternative schooling programs for folks who don't thrive in the normal public school setting. The city supported this with community development block grants over really the last 25 years. We've also put some revolving loan fund money into the program. Real estate-wise, the school district sold them Garrison School for a very nominal amount of money, as I mentioned earlier. The city has the West Concord Fire Station, which we've been leasing to Second Start since the 1970s for $1 a year so they can operate some of their programs. So that's how we have skin in the game with those folks. Excellent. Jim Snodgrass, Citizen of the Year, has done a phenomenal job with this over the last 4 decades. Concord Boys and Girls Club over by Kimball Park. They're actually located on city property and have been there since the 1980s. We leased them their property for $1 a year. They did a renovation back about 10 years ago, which was about $4 million to expand their capacity up to 220 children, which was important. To support that, the city had to extend our lease out to 2039. We were happy to do that. We secured $500,000 in CDBG money to support their improvements. And we also worked with the state to help modify some Land and Water Conservation Fund grant restrictions at Kimball Park to allow for them to expand their footprint at the property. This is up on the Heights, which, the other thing I want to mention here is we're supporting childcare projects and housing projects throughout the city. They're not in just one neighborhood. We're spreading them throughout the 67 square miles that is Concord. This is up on Burns Avenue in the Heights, runs parallel to Loudon Road. They have a program that serves 250 children and families. Back in 2013, they needed to renovate their facility, and we worked with them to secure about $300,000 of CDBG funds, both in 1998 and in 2013 to help do that. Merrimack Valley Daycare Service, again established in the 1970s over by Concord High School here on North Fruit Street. Mary Jane Wallner used to run that operation. They have multiple facilities throughout central New Hampshire. In Concord on Fruit Street, they have capacity for 65 kids. We have secured community development block grants for them back since the 1990s forward. You can see the dollar amount there. We've also put money into their program, their facility really, through the revolving loan fund program that the city has. And when we make a loan to these folks, we're not trying to get rich. This is for an interest rate that is below market. It's usually sub-Wall Street Journal prime. And again, it's really just to try and make sure we can help those people deliver their mission as low cost as possible so they can control costs with the community and their clients. The YMCA, Jim Doremus, done a lot of good work while he was there. We were happy to partner with him on a lot of things. They're over on Warren Street, as y'all know. There's a childcare center there, does all day and after school. They do summer camp. The city sold the old firehouse block facility. This is one of our fire stations from back in the day. We sold it for $1 in 1980. That helped beget the Y, this facility, as well as some of the affordable housing that is around that particular property on Warren Street. Community development block grants over the last couple of years. In 2017, we helped with improvements to the child care facility, elevator improvements, things of that nature. So how we've worked there. Lastly, you all know about this project. It's something the city's very proud of up on the Heights on Canterbury Road. It's our new citywide multi-generational community center. That's former Dames School. We purchased it for $1 from the Concord School District and renovated it into the facility you see here today, which is about 35,000 square feet. It's about an $8 million project, a little bit under that. One of the things that we do there is we operate our summer camp programs there, which provide capacity for 1,500 children every summer, so that's important. On the housing side of the box, or the house I should say, Scandia Hall. This is an old community center that was built by the Swedes in the late 1800s. It was turned over to the city in the 60s. We closed it in 1994 on Knight Street. This is right across the street from Second Start, by the way. So Community Development 101, improving neighborhoods. We work on both sides of the road. So on this side, we decided to sell the property on to a development team that was led by Mark Currier, who was a general contractor who passed away not too long ago. And John Jordan is the local architect. They turned into 4 units of market rate housing. Generates about $32,000 a year in property taxes, which is good for the city because this was a tax exempt property forever. We sold it on to the developers for $20,000 back in 2011 in the depths of the recession. I can tell you that the units there right now are assessed at about $300,000 a piece. So expanded supply, took a blighted property out of a neighborhood, put it back into production, and added for really in historic preservation too. We saved the building that's important to that neighborhood. Menino Place, Catch Neighborhood Housing, we've worked with them a lot over the years. This was 45 units of primarily affordable housing. It's located to the rear of the Smile building down on Store Street. We supported that with a $450,000 community development block grant, which really helped them pay for the land to build that project. There were other incentives that they benefited as well that were more attached to the Smile building. Again with Catch in 2013, when they expanded their supply of affordable housing in downtown, it gave them some flexibility on how to deal with the Endicott Hotel, which was an old affordable housing project that was tired and needed to be renovated. It was turned into 27 units of market rate housing. The city supported that with an RSA 7090 tax relief incentive, which basically froze their assessment for a period of 5 years. We gave them a loan through our revolving loan fund program to update their facade, no payments for the first 18 months so they could get cash flow, and assisted with resolving some historic CDBG issues on that property. And I understand that Mr. Furtado is in the process of adding 1 more unit to that building, converting some of the office space into 2-bedroom units. So there's still demand. We worked with Remy Hinxia on the old Remy block, which is, well, the new Remy block. It's the old Vegas block. Tough project. It was a building that had been condemned by the state fire marshal. There were 4 banks involved, including the city, to get a financing plan together to make this project work. It is 20 units of market rate housing. We supported it with RSA 79E, which again froze the assessed value at the pre-improvement level of the building, which gave an additional $314,000 over time, which allowed the developer to pay for more debt service to get the project done. We also participated in a loan agreement with CRDC to spread their risk. Whoops, sorry about that. So there we go. I'm over time, but I'll finish up quickly. Pleasant Street and Elm Grove, you're familiar with their projects on Pleasant Street and South State Street. The city supported those as well, 13 units on Pleasant, another 14 units that were added on South State Street. Beautiful market rate units. Dixon Avenue, same thing, development project with the Dupree Company has added 7 units onto that building at 4 to 6 Dixon. You can see how the city supported that, again, with RSA 79E. The tannery site up in Pennacook, you're all familiar with that. 34 units of affordable housing that were built there and opened in 2020 after an extensive cleanup project with on that property over 20 years. There's another 20 units that are coming shortly, pending the outcome of the upcoming, the current LIHTC round at New Hampshire Housing, and the city's getting ready to build a park at the site, portion of the site that we retained. We also have supported other housing across the spectrum here. We recently partnered with Rock NH to help a new co-op at 190 Manchester Street to do some water and sewer infrastructure improvements using community development block grant funds. These are up on Manchester Street, very modest homes. These people are very proud that they were able to buy their park and are making the investments that's long needed. Catch is working on Rosemary's Way. I toured it yesterday. Beautiful project. We sold the land, a portion of the site to them so they could do it. And the first tenants are going to be moving in here in the next couple of months. Employment security on South Main Street, you all know about that project. The city owns that site. We're selling it on to the Flatley Company to do 64 units of market rate housing. We supported that through some regulatory changes. We changed the zoning. We're doing some asbestos abatement there now, and we're anticipating that construction will start next spring. There are about 1,000 units that are in pre-development right now with the planning board in various stages when you think about that, and we added about 600 units in the last decade. That will make a real difference if those all come to fruition in our community. And then lastly, George alluded to this, Heather Shank and the planning staff and community development are working on Concord Next, which is a zoning, an update of our zoning ordinance, which is about 20 years old. We're looking at a variety of things: setbacks, density in neighborhoods, reduced parking standards. How can we further densify some of our neighborhoods in our urban growth boundary where water, sewer, and transportation infrastructure exist? So you'll be seeing that coming forward probably within the next year or so. And with that, I'm done.
Thank you, gentlemen. I should also mention Concord TV is here with us today. Great supporters of the community and great partners in the chamber. So Josh and Michael, thank you for being here. So we do have a few minutes for Q&A, and I just want to say how impressed I was. We've done a lot of breakfast forums since I've been at the chamber, and typically you have to bite your nails a little bit depending on who the speaker is and whether they go over. And you folks actually timed your speaking, and that's quite impressive, so thank you. We're open for questions. I'll kick it off. Oh, please do.
Is somebody missing a phone?
Yes, that's mine.
Make sure. It's a BlackBerry, I'd say it was Doremus's, but I'll move it over here. I was nervous that
Thanks, Tom.
was-
Appreciate that.
Okay.
I thought you had a more substantive question for me, but.
Okay.
So just I'm not sure who to direct this towards, but one of the impediments to building new housing in communities has been, municipalities afraid that, oh, we're going to build these new units and all of a sudden we're going to be bringing a ton of kids into the school system, and that's really going to racket up our property tax rates. And you hear statistics like, well, for every unit you're going to have 2.5 kids. Can any of you comment on what the real number looks like for when you build new units and how that really impacts local school districts?
Yeah, I can, Tim. New Hampshire Housing has done through Russ Debo from Applied Economic Research a few studies over the years, so it's a few years old. I can't tell you the exact number, but like for a multifamily unit, like maybe MT or Menino Place, might be 0.17 child, in the unit. Where it contributes the most to the school system is usually a larger single-family detached home, which might be 0.3 or 0.4 of a child, so it's way far from the 2. The other thing I don't like about that is it continues this negative frame that we just want to have fractions of children. I know that for most of us, our school population has decreased, so we've got a different problem. What I would like to put out there is how we kind of misuse numbers. So you can have a number of students in the school system and divide the school budget by that child, come up with a number, maybe 10,000. But that's not the cost when you have 5 new kids or you lose 5. If you lose 5, you don't decrease your school budget by 50,000 because school budgets are fixed costs. And when you add, you have to think about capacity. When you add a student, what is the marginal cost for that? Not this 10,000. So there's a challenge on how we think about it. We might tend to oversimplify it. I would mention that the Hampshire Association of Realtors put out a study with Dr. Richard England, who kind of looked at school systems around the state and looked at the school population and taxes. And to say the least, there's not a direct correlation. So it causes us to wonder. And I go back to Urban 3 and Joe Manicosa, like, where do our revenues come from and how do we pay for the costs we have, school being a big part of it, but certainly roads and infrastructure.
Yeah, I would just add that the misconception about that is the negative consequences with adding children. I look at communities across New Hampshire or anywhere throughout the country, and I think, when you have families with children in a community, that's a wonderful demographic. They're the most invested people in communities. They're forward-thinking. They want the community to succeed. They take a long-term view. That, to me, is the larger benefit, and is never in the calculus of what the cost of children are. Communities that have children have the most invested citizens in the community. And so I wish that somehow could be factored into the equation.
Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. I'm Kathleen Murphy. I'm the superintendent of schools in Concord. So these are really good comments. Brian, I think I have a solution for your childcare issue, and that's universal pre-K. I know that everyone's a little nervous about that, but what universal pre-K does is that provides that kind of support for families, children in structured environments, in a learning environment, in a positive learning environment. But it also frees up space in the current childcare, because I've met with the folks from the Boys and Girls Club, because they lease space out at Eastman School, and they like to increase their space, and not for older kids, but for the very young ones. So by having universal pre-K, which is part of our school system, that would free up space in childcare. I've been involved in early learning programs and studies in the state for a while, and clearly childcare centers, they're closing. They can't afford to remain open because of just the cost to run a childcare, and of course the employment issue is huge. I think somebody showed that on a slide today. I think you did, Brian, but I think it has to really be considered as an avenue to allow our workforce to come back. To provide a positive environment for all kids, including those who have and those who do not have, and then providing an outlet for our daycares that are currently operating. So that's my solution.
If I'm not mistaken, I think there's a universal pre-K in some of the proposals at the federal government level.
Right.
Part of the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better proposal. Now, it's also one of the most controversial, but I agree 100%. I mean, childcare is one of the most difficult, from a business perspective, economic problems that you can deal with, because we know there's tremendous demand. There's not enough supply. Usually when there's a lot of demand, supply rises to meet that demand. The problem with that, of course, is that in order to induce more supply, you have to allow people to earn enough money to want to be a supplier. In order to do that, you have to raise the price of childcare, which will reduce the demand. So it's kind of a cycle that can't be addressed the way it's been addressed. Great to hear Matt talk about the childcare issue, because there's some really innovative solutions that have been done there. And I'm a private sector guy. I've had 2 years in government now, or I went to the dark side, as my friends say. Is that there's subsidies involved, and in most successful child care programs in other countries, there is a subsidy, and in this case, I think very effective subsidies in terms of space, either the selling of the space or the leasing of the space. That's one of the ways to subsidize without any real direct expenditure. So it's going to be very difficult to address without a subsidy. That's the ultimate subsidy, is universal pre-K. And by the way, that addresses some real equity issues that are also involved with child care, because let's be realistic, people who have more means have more access to child care, whether or not there's a shortage of supply. So the universal aspect of it begins to address some of the equity issues that over the long term have tremendous payback from my perspective.
Laura? Then John?
Thank you. A couple of points, and Brian, you touched on it. I worked on childcare, the economic impact of childcare like 20 years ago, and it's the same discussion because people don't view, not people in this room do, but not everybody views childcare as a business. It's still thought of as people taking care of children as opposed to the business model. And yet you have all these other essential businesses that get subsidies from government at all levels, and childcare, if they get any, it's pennies. And so really looking at subsidizing childcare as a needed infrastructure component of a successful economy needs to be taken seriously. So that's one piece. Putting on my housing hat, I think the biggest impediment to multifamily, denser development housing, and I've said this for years, is water and sewer. After working in municipalities that didn't have water and sewer infrastructure, that's the first thing that stops anything, because it's all on well and septic systems. So if you have to put in larger well and septic systems to serve multiple housing units, is cost prohibitive. So the communities that have water and sewer infrastructure are the ones that tend to have the denser developments. And for years at the state and federal level, there's been no new money for water and sewer expansion or new. And that's why we've seen, in my opinion, the stagnation of that type of development. So until, I mean, you can change the zoning and the rules all you want, but if you can't flush your toilet or turn your tap on, you're not going to get more of that housing. So that, to me, is the base level. If we can figure out ways to do that, I think some of our housing issues will maybe become resolved, or at least take that block away from it. So, thank you.
Mary, you had a question?
Yeah. Jonathan Hopkins, I'm the pastor of Concordia Lutheran Church. We run a daycare in our church. I would offer just this one little piece of things that I think would help a whole lot, and that is the state subsidy for low-income people. If the state could still reimburse the child care center for days that the kids are not there, like when they're sick, that would be huge. They almost did it. I think they almost did it last legislative session, and they voted it down for some reason, but that would make like a huge, especially in COVID, because we still have kids that we're sending home almost daily for runny noses and other such things. But anyway, that would help with the economics of it.
So being a mother of a young child, I have the personal experience of paying about $365 a week for infant care. And that is for high quality child care that my husband and I are very fortunate to be able to afford. However, there are many families who can't make that choice. They don't have that option. So while public schools are definitely a huge help to some of the older children, I think that it's important for us as a community to think about how we're investing in our young children, in our infants, in our families at those early stages. because if we don't support families at those early stages, it breaks some of the foundations.
I'm going to throw a question to the panel, and this has to do with a trend I think we're just beginning to see, and it's reminiscent of the MSK manufacturing company in Manchester that provided housing for their employees. We're starting to see a little bit of that happen in the state. Do you anticipate this to continue, or do you think this is just sort of a Band-Aid approach while we have this shortage? I'm going to try that one.
So, I've heard stories from some of my colleagues in Portsmouth, which is probably one of the most expensive housing markets in the state, where pre-pandemic restaurateurs were actually buying up units, so their kitchen staff, their wait staff would have an affordable place to live. And I remember having a conversation with that person about, is this happening in Concord? And I said, no, Concord has its affordability issues, but we're not Portsmouth yet. We also have 67 square miles of land that gives us far more flexibility on how we can try and address some of these needs than what Portsmouth has, because Portsmouth is hemmed in by the Atlantic Ocean and a few other things, so it's much smaller. I don't know if it will, I suppose if this continues like this for a while, that may happen depending on what market it is, whether it's Portsmouth or Bedford or some other place. I haven't heard of it yet here in Concord. I don't know what's happening post-pandemic, well, not really post-pandemic yet, but I don't know what's happening now that the pandemic is here and the impact that it's occurred on the restaurant industry and some of the other service industries.
I think I'll just add to that. I think it's a great question. I'm not really sure. I mean, there's economic forces at work. Certainly that employers are looking to say, if I'm going to stay here, what's my challenge with housing? I know Harmony Homes, John and Maggie Randolph, Harmony Homes is a retirement assisted living in Dover, or in Durham, and they just couldn't find housing for their employees. So they actually built that themselves. It's a model that's not really replicable. I went back after ribbon cutting the governor was at, and I wanted to get more pictures, and both John and Maggie were painting the back of the house, so that's what's going on there. Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, they've got their own land, and they're kind of looking at a partnership, public-private partnership. I think we may see more of those with businesses thinking of maybe signing on master leases with developers to help them get financing to develop, and that master lease, which I think is kind of what we've done, is sort of, it allows that bank financing to happen. So I think there's just these forces at work. I will say that from a housing perspective, most employers aren't looking to be engaged in housing development and management. And I think that to sort of say to a business that, if you're going to bring in 100 employees, you ought to get the housing for it, I think would be a misinterpretation of our role. I think there's a partnership that can be involved there that includes, again, looking at, I think, our land use policy to make sure we're attracting those employers and employees want to bring in.
Thank you. Well, we are right at 9 o'clock, so I think this is a good time to conclude. I want to thank our speakers. They did an excellent job. I want to thank all of you for coming, and remind you we've got some upcoming events at the Chamber. You can check them out on our website. But one thing I would like to mention is we have our annual meeting coming up November 3rd, and we're excited about that event, so hope you can join us for that. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.